The 16-year-old girl's hands trembled as she held the crumpled letter, her tears mixing with the crayon marks her little brother had drawn on the back. Julian Devereux, the billionaire CEO who had humiliated her just hours before, now stood frozen in his marble foyer, reading words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about sacrifice and family. The drawing showed stick figures holding hands with the words, "Thank you, Carmen, for saving us," scrolled in purple crayon, and as Julian's vision blurred with tears he never thought he'd shed, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can bridge the widest gaps between two completely different worlds. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of the Devereux mansion as Carmen Alvarez adjusted her black uniform for the third time. At 16, she had been working as a maid for the wealthy family for 8 months now, ever since her father had been laid off from the construction company and her mother's illness had worsened. The weight of supporting her family pressed down on her small shoulders like an invisible burden she carried everywhere she went. Carmen's dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her worn but clean uniform spoke of someone who took pride in her work despite the circumstances that had brought her here. She had learned to move quietly through the grand hallways, to blend into the background like a shadow, to anticipate the needs of the household staff and the occasional high-profile guests who visited the estate. Today was different, though. Today, Julian Devereux himself would be conducting an important business meeting in the main sitting room, and Carmen had been specifically assigned to serve refreshments. Julian Devereux was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered any room. At 32, he had built his technology empire from nothing, transforming a small software startup into a multi-billion-dollar corporation that employed thousands of people across the globe. His success had made him wealthy beyond imagination, but it had also made him cold, calculating, and utterly intolerant of mistakes. He expected perfection from everyone around him, from his board members to his household staff, and he had little patience for those who failed to meet his impossibly high standards. The sitting room had been prepared with meticulous care for the morning's meeting. Crystal glasses gleamed on silver trays. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, and the antique mahogany table had been polished to mirror perfection. Carmen had spent an hour the previous evening arranging everything just so, double-checking each detail to ensure that nothing would go wrong. She understood that her job depended on these kinds of events going smoothly, and with her family's financial situation growing more desperate by the day, she could not afford to make any mistakes. As the morning progressed, Carmen found herself growing increasingly nervous about the meeting. She had heard whispers among the other staff members about the importance of today's negotiations, something about a merger that would affect millions of jobs and reshape entire industries. The pressure to perform flawlessly weighed heavily on her mind as she made her final preparations in the kitchen, carefully arranging delicate pastries on bone china plates and brewing the special blend of tea that Julian preferred for important occasions. The guests began arriving at precisely 10 o'clock, their expensive cars pulling up the circular driveway in a parade of luxury and power. Carmen watched from the kitchen window as men and women in $1,000 suits emerged from their vehicles, their faces serious and focused as they prepared for what everyone knew would be a crucial meeting. She recognized several faces from business magazines and news programs, titans of industry who controlled vast fortunes and wielded enormous influence over the global economy. Julian emerged from his study wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Carmen's family made in 6 months. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes gleamed like mirrors, and his entire demeanor radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money or security. He moved through his home like a king surveying his domain, occasionally barking orders at the staff or adjusting details that only he seemed to notice. Carmen had been working in wealthy households long enough to recognize the type of man Julian was, someone who had grown so accustomed to luxury and deference that he had forgotten what it felt like to struggle or to worry about basic necessities. She had seen it before in other employers, the way wealth could insulate people from the harsh realities that dominated the lives of those who served them. Still, she needed this job desperately, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. The meeting began with typical corporate formalities, handshakes and pleasantries exchanged between people who saw each other as either allies or obstacles to their respective goals. Carmen remained in the background, refilling water glasses and ensuring that everyone had everything they needed while trying to remain as invisible as possible. She had learned that the wealthy preferred their servants to be efficient but unobtrusive, present when needed but otherwise forgettable. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. Carmen moved seamlessly between the kitchen and the sitting room, anticipating needs before they were expressed and maintaining the perfect balance between attentiveness and discretion. The business discussion grew increasingly intense as the participants debated terms and conditions, their voices rising and falling with the ebb and flow of negotiation. Carmen could sense the tension in the room building like pressure in a steam kettle, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited for someone to either reach an agreement or walk away from the table. It was during the second hour of the meeting that disaster struck. Carmen had just finished refilling the tea service and was carefully carrying the heavy silver tray back toward the kitchen when one of the guests made an unexpected gesture while speaking. His arm swept outward in emphasis, catching Carmen completely off guard as she passed behind his chair. The sudden movement startled her, causing her to stumble slightly and lose her grip on the tray's handles. Time seemed to slow down as Carmen watched in horror as the entire tea service tilted precariously, the elegant teapot sliding toward the edge of the silver tray like a ship going down in a storm. She made a desperate attempt to regain control, lunging forward to catch the falling pot, but her efforts only made things worse. The scalding hot tea erupted from the spout in a dark brown arc that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before gravity claimed it. The tea landed squarely on Julian Devereux's pristine white shirt and expensive suit jacket, the dark liquid spreading across the fabric like ink on paper. The room fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened, the important business discussion forgotten in the face of this unexpected catastrophe. Carmen stood frozen in place, still holding the now empty tray, her face pale with shock and terror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Julian's reaction was immediate and explosive. His face turned red with rage as he jumped to his feet, hot tea dripping from his clothes onto the Persian rug below. His eyes blazed with fury as he turned to face Carmen, his voice rising to a volume that echoed throughout the mansion like thunder. The transformation from composed businessman to angry tyrant was so complete and so sudden that several of the guests actually took a step backward, as if they feared they might be caught in the crossfire of his wrath. "You incompetent little fool!" Julian roared, his voice carrying throughout the house and causing other staff members to freeze in their tracks wherever they happened to be working. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the importance of this meeting? Do you comprehend how your carelessness has just humiliated me in front of the most important people in my industry?" Carmen felt tears welling up in her eyes as Julian continued his tirade, his words cutting through her like knives. She wanted to apologize, to explain that it had been an accident, to somehow make things right, but the intensity of his anger left her speechless. She had never seen anyone so furious over what seemed like such a minor mishap, and she struggled to understand why someone with so much wealth and power would be so devastated by a simple stain on his clothing. "I should fire you right now," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was somehow more frightening than his shouting had been. "I should make sure that you never work in this city again, that everyone knows about your incompetence and your inability to perform even the simplest tasks without causing disaster. You have cost me more than you could possibly imagine, and I want you out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret." The other business people in the room watched the scene unfold with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination. Clearly uncomfortable with Julian's explosive reaction but unwilling to intervene in what they saw as a private matter between an employer and his employee, some of them had probably witnessed similar scenes in their own companies. Moments when the pressure of high-stakes business dealings caused normally composed individuals to lose control of their emotions. Carmen managed to find her voice long enough to whisper a barely audible apology. Before fleeing from the room, her face burning with shame and humiliation, she ran through the mansion's corridors like a frightened animal, past startled maids and butlers who had heard the commotion and gathered to see what had happened. She burst through the servants' entrance and into the bright morning sunlight, gasping for air as if she had been drowning in the suffocating atmosphere of Julian's rage. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, found Carmen 20 minutes later sitting on a bench behind the garden shed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mrs. Morrison was a kind woman in her 60s who had worked for wealthy families her entire life, and she had seen her share of young servants broken by the casual cruelty of their employers. She sat down beside Carmen and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering the kind of comfort that only someone who had experienced similar humiliation could provide. "He's sending me home for the day," Mrs. Morrison said softly, her Scottish accent making her words sound like a lullaby. "He says he doesn't want to see you again until tomorrow, when he's had time to cool down and decide what to do with you. I've seen him angry before, child, but never quite like that." Something about that meeting must have been more important than any of us realized. Carmen looked up at Mrs. Morrison with red-rimmed eyes, her young face streaked with tears and twisted with anguish. "I need this job, Mrs. Morrison. My family, they're counting on me. My mother's medical bills, my little brother's school supplies, the rent that's already 2 months behind. If Mr. Devereux fires me, I don't know what we'll do. There aren't many places that will hire someone my age, and none of them pay as well as this position does." Mrs. Morrison nodded understandingly, having heard similar stories from dozens of young servants over the years. The wealthy often forgot that their employees had lives and responsibilities beyond the walls of their mansions, that a moment of anger or a snap decision could destroy entire families who depended on those wages for survival. She had seen good people lose everything because of minor mistakes or personality conflicts with their employers, and she had learned that sometimes the only thing that could save a servant's job was time and patience. "Go home to your family," Mrs. Morrison advised, helping Carmen to her feet and brushing the dirt from her uniform. "Take the rest of the day to compose yourself, and come back tomorrow ready to work harder than you've ever worked before." Sometimes these wealthy men need time to remember that we're all human beings who make mistakes, and sometimes they surprise you with their capacity for forgiveness. But you mustn't give up hope, not when your family needs you so desperately. Carmen walked home through the affluent neighborhood surrounding the Devereux estate, her mind racing with thoughts of what she would tell her family and how they would manage if she lost her job. The contrast between the perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars she passed and the small, cramped apartment where her family lived was stark and depressing. She had grown accustomed to moving between these two worlds, but today the distance between them seemed insurmountable. The Alvarez family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better days, where the elevator rarely worked and the heating system broke down every winter without fail. Carmen's mother, Maria, spent most of her days in bed, battling the chronic illness that had gradually sapped her strength and left her unable to work. Her father, Roberto, had been looking for steady employment for months, taking whatever odd jobs he could find but never earning enough to cover all of their expenses. Carmen's 8-year-old brother, Diego, was the brightest spot in their difficult situation. Despite their family's great financial struggles, he maintained an optimistic outlook that sometimes amazed Carmen with its resilience. He excelled in school, despite having to wear second-hand clothes, carry a backpack that had been repaired with duct tape multiple times. He never complained about their circumstances or asked for things they couldn't afford. And he treated Carmen like a hero for working so hard to support their family. When Carmen arrived home that afternoon, she found Diego sitting at their small kitchen table working on his homework, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he carefully formed letters on a piece of notebook paper. He looked up with a bright smile when she walked through the door, immediately noticing that she was home much earlier than usual and that her eyes were red from crying. "Carmen, what's wrong?" Diego asked, abandoning his homework and rushing to give her a hug. "Did something bad happen at work? You look like you've been crying, and you're never home this early unless something's wrong. Is it because of us? Is it because we need too much money and it's making your job harder?" Carmen hugged her little brother tightly, feeling fresh tears threatening to spill over as she realized how perceptive he was and how much responsibility he felt for their family's situation. At 8 years old, Diego already understood that their lives were different from those of his classmates, that money was always tight, and that Carmen worked long hours at a job she didn't enjoy in order to keep their family afloat. The fact that he worried about being a burden to her broke her heart in ways she couldn't express. "It's not your fault, Diego," Carmen said, stroking his dark hair and trying to keep her voice steady. "I just had a bad day at work, that's all. Sometimes grown-ups get angry about things that aren't really important, and today I accidentally spilled something on my boss's clothes. He was very upset with me, but Mrs. Morrison says he might feel better tomorrow after he's had time to think about it." Diego pulled back to look at her with his serious brown eyes, the same eyes she saw in the mirror every morning when she got ready for work. "Is he going to fire you? Because if he does, I can quit school and get a job to help out. I'm really good at math, and I can read better than most kids in my class, so I bet someone would hire me to do something useful. We're a team, Carmen, and teams help each other when things get tough." The offer from her 8-year-old brother to quit school and find work nearly broke Carmen's composure entirely. She pulled in close again, holding him tight while she struggled to maintain control of her emotions. The fact that Diego was willing to sacrifice his education and his childhood to help support their family was both heartbreaking, inspiring, and it reminded her why she was fighting so hard to keep her job at the Devereux mansion. "You're not quitting school, Diego," Carmen said firmly, her voice muffled against his hair. "Your job is to be a kid and to learn everything you can so that someday you can have a better life than any of us ever dreamed of. My job is to work and to take care of our family, and I'm going to keep doing that no matter what happens. We're going to be okay, I promise." That evening, after their mother had gone to sleep and their father had left for his night shift security job, Carmen sat with Diego while he finished his homework. She watched him work with the kind of focus and determination that reminded her of herself at that age, back when she still believed that hard work and good grades would be enough to ensure a bright future. She had learned the hard way that life was more complicated than that, but she was determined that Diego would have opportunities she had never been given. As Diego worked on a writing assignment about his family, Carmen found herself thinking about Julian Devereux and the fury she had seen in his eyes that morning. She tried to understand what could have made him so angry over what was essentially a minor accident, but she couldn't comprehend the kind of pressure and responsibility that came with managing a billion-dollar empire. From her perspective, his reaction had seemed cruel and disproportionate, but she wondered if there were factors she didn't understand that had contributed to his explosive response. "Carmen, can you help me with this?" Diego asked, holding up his pencil and looking at her with a confused expression. "The teacher wants us to write about someone in our family who is a hero, and I want to write about you. But I'm not sure how to explain why you're so special. How do I tell people about all the things you do for us without making it sound like we're poor or that Mama and Papa can't take care of us?" Carmen felt her heart swell with love and pride as she looked at her little brother's earnest face. The fact that he saw her as a hero despite their difficult circumstances meant more to her than any praise she had ever received from employers or teachers. She helped him organize his thoughts and find the right words to express his feelings, watching as he carefully wrote about how she worked every day to help their family and always made sure he had everything he needed for school. That night, as Carmen lay in the bed she shared with Diego in their small apartment, she found herself unable to sleep. Her mind kept returning to the events of the day, replaying Julian's angry words and wondering what would happen when she returned to work the next morning. She thought about all the bills that needed to be paid, all the expenses that her family couldn't afford, and all the ways her life might change if she lost her job. But as she listened to Diego's peaceful breathing beside her and heard her parents talking quietly in the next room about their plans for the future, Carmen felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had been working and fighting for her family's survival for months now, and she wasn't going to give up just because one wealthy man had lost his temper over a stained shirt. She would return to the mansion tomorrow and prove that she deserved to keep her job, no matter what it took. The next morning, Carmen woke up early and spent extra time preparing for work. She pressed her uniform until it was perfect, styled her hair with exceptional care, and practiced the apology she planned to deliver to Julian if she was given the opportunity. She wanted to look professional and composed, to show that she took her responsibilities seriously and was committed to doing better in the future. Before leaving for work, Carmen sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Julian Devereux. She had never written anything like it before, but she felt compelled to try to explain herself and to ask for another chance. The words came slowly at first, but then began to flow as she opened her heart and shared the story of her family's struggles and her desperate need to keep working. "Dear Mr. Devereux," she began, her handwriting careful and neat despite the trembling of her hands. "I want to apologize for what happened yesterday during your important meeting. I know that spilling tea on your clothes was unacceptable, and I understand why you were so angry with me. I have been thinking about it all night, and I realize that I let you down when you needed me to be perfect." Carmen continued writing, pouring her heart out onto the paper as she explained about her family's situation and how much her job meant to their survival. She wrote about her mother's illness and her father's unemployment, about Diego's dreams of going to college someday, and her determination to make sure he had that opportunity. She tried to convey the depth of her commitment to her work and her willingness to do whatever it took to prove herself worthy of a second chance. "I know that you don't owe me anything," she wrote. "And I know that there are probably dozens of people who could do my job without making the kind of mistake I made yesterday. But I want you to know that this job means everything to my family. And I promise that if you give me another chance, I will work harder than anyone has ever worked for you before. I will be the best maid you have ever employed, and I will never, ever let you down again." As Carmen finished the letter, Diego appeared beside her, still in his pajamas and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He looked at the paper in front of her with curiosity, then asked if he could add something to it. Carmen handed him a crayon from the box they kept for his art projects, and she watched as he carefully drew a picture on the back of the letter. The drawing was simple but heartfelt, showing stick figures of their family holding hands under a smiling sun. Diego labeled each figure with their names, and at the bottom he wrote in his best handwriting, "Thank you, Carmen, for saving us." When he finished, he looked up at Carmen with his serious brown eyes and said, "Maybe if he sees that you're somebody's hero, he'll understand why you need to keep your job." Carmen felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at her brother's innocent drawing and the words he had written. The simple message seemed to capture everything she had been trying to express in her formal letter, but with a purity and honesty that only a child could provide. She folded the letter carefully, making sure Diego's drawing remained visible, and tucked it into her uniform pocket. When Carmen arrived at the mansion that morning, She found the atmosphere among the staff tense and subdued. Word had spread quickly about the previous day's incident, and everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells, afraid that Julian's anger might spill over onto them as well. Mrs. Morrison greeted Carmen with a worried expression and informed her that Julian had requested to see her in his study as soon as she arrived. Carmen's heart pounded as she walked through the mansion's corridors toward Julian's study, the letter in her pocket feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, but now that the moment had arrived, her mind felt blank and her throat felt dry. She knocked softly on the study door and waited for permission to enter, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to face the man who held her family's future in his hands. Julian was seated behind his massive mahogany desk when Carmen entered, his expression unreadable as he looked up from the documents he had been reviewing. He appeared to have fully recovered from the previous day's incident, his clothing immaculate and his demeanor composed, but Carmen could sense an underlying tension in the way he held himself. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk, and she perched on the edge of it nervously, waiting for him to speak. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," Julian began, his voice carefully controlled and professional. "I realize that my reaction may have been somewhat excessive, but you must understand that the meeting you disrupted was crucial to the future of my company. Millions of dollars and thousands of jobs were at stake, and your carelessness could have cost me more than you can possibly imagine." Carmen nodded, not trusting herself to speak as Julian continued his measured explanation. She could see that he was trying to remain calm and reasonable, but she could also sense the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. She clutched the letter in her pocket, waiting for the right moment to present it, and hoping that her words would somehow bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. "However," Julian continued, "Mrs. Morrison has spoken to me about your circumstances, and I understand that you have responsibilities that extend beyond this job. I'm not entirely without compassion. Despite what you might think based on yesterday's incident, I'm willing to give you one more chance, but it will be your last. One more mistake, no matter how minor, and you'll be terminated immediately. Do I make myself clear?" Carmen felt a rush of relief so intense that it nearly knocked her off her chair. She had been prepared for the worst, and Julian's offer of a second chance felt like a miracle. She started to thank him, but then remembered the letter in her pocket and felt compelled to share it with him. She pulled out the folded paper with trembling hands and placed it on his desk, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained what it was. "Mr. Devereux, I wrote this for you last night," Carmen said, her words coming out in a rush. "I wanted to apologize properly and to help you understand why this job is so important to me. My little brother added something to it too, because he wanted you to know how much your kindness means to our family. I don't expect you to read it now, but maybe someday when you have time, you could look at it and remember that sometimes people make mistakes not because they'll care, but because they're trying so hard to do everything right." End quote. Julian looked at the letter with mild curiosity, but made no move to open it. Instead, he placed it in a drawer of his desk and turned his attention back to Carmen with a businesslike expression. "Very well, Miss Alvarez. You may return to your duties, and we'll consider this matter closed. But remember what I said about second chances. I don't believe in third chances, so make sure you don't give me a reason to reconsider my decision." Carmen thanked him profusely and left his study feeling as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She threw herself into her work with renewed energy and determination, taking extra care with every task and double-checking every detail to ensure that nothing could go wrong. She felt like she had been given a new lease on life, and she was determined to prove that Julian's faith in her had not been misplaced. Over the following weeks, Carmen worked harder than she had ever worked before. She arrived early and stayed late, volunteered for extra tangine duties, and maintained the highest standards of performance in everything she did. The other staff members noticed her dedication and began to comment on how much she had changed since the incident with Julian. Some of them had bull prey, expected her to be fired, and they were impressed by her resilience and her commitment to excellence. Julian, meanwhile, seemed to have forgotten about the entire incident. He returned to his usual routine of high-pressure meetings and international business dealings, treating Carmen with the same polite indifference he showed to all of his household staff. He didn't mention the letter she had given him, and Carmen began to wonder if he had even bothered to read it. She tried not to think about it too much, focusing instead on her work and her determination to prove herself worthy of the trust he had placed in her. It was 3 weeks after the tea incident that Julian finally opened Carmen's letter. He had been working late, in his study, reviewing financial reports and preparing for yet another crucial business meeting, when he noticed the folded paper in his desk drawer. He had completely forgotten about it in the chaos of his demanding schedule. But something about the way the lamplight caught the edge of the paper reminded him of the young maid's earnest expression when she had placed it on his desk. Julian unfolded the letter with casual interest, expecting to find a simple apology and perhaps a plea for mercy. Instead, he found himself reading the most heartfelt and honest piece of writing he had encountered in years. Carmen's words painted a vivid picture of a family struggling to survive, of a teenage girl who had sacrificed her own childhood to support her loved ones, and of the desperate circumstances that had driven her to seek employment in his household. As Julian read about Carmen's mother's illness and her father's unemployment, about the bills that couldn't be paid and the dreams that seemed impossible to achieve, he felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. The wealth and privilege that had insulated him from such concerns for so long suddenly seemed like barriers that had prevented him from seeing the real world, where people like Carmen fought daily battles for survival. But it was when Julian turned the letter over and saw Diego's crayon drawing that something inside him finally broke. The simple stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun, the childish handwriting that proclaimed, "Thank you, Carmen, for saving us," the innocent faith of a little boy who saw his sister as a hero. All of it combined to create an emotional impact that Julian was completely unprepared for. Julian Devereux, the billionaire CEO who commanded boardrooms and controlled vast business empires, found himself crying over a child's drawing. The tears came without warning, streaming down his face as he stared at the simple picture and tried to comprehend the depth of love and sacrifice it represented. He thought about his own childhood, about the advantages he had been given and the opportunities that had been handed to him on a silver platter. And he realized how different his life might have been if he had been born into Carmen's circumstances. First time in years, Julian allowed himself to think about the human cost of his success. He thought about all the employees he had fired over minor mistakes, all the families he had disrupted with his corporate decisions, all the people whose lives had been affected by his pursuit of profit and efficiency. He had always told himself that business was business, that personal considerations had no place in the corporate world. But Carmen's letter had forced him to confront the reality that every decision he made had consequences for real people with real families and real dreams. Julian sat in his study for hours that night, holding Diego's drawing and rereading Carmen's letter until he had memorized every word. He thought about the fury he had felt when the tea had stained his shirt, about the importance he had placed on that particular meeting, about the way he had humiliated a 16-year-old girl in front of a room full of powerful businessmen. His reaction seemed petty and cruel now, the tantrum of a spoiled man who had never learned to put his problems in proper perspective. But more than that, Julian found himself thinking about Carmen herself and the courage it must have taken for her to write such an honest letter. She had opened her heart to him completely, sharing her family's most private struggles and her own fears and hopes for the future. She had trusted him with information that could have made her vulnerable to further humiliation, but she had chosen to be honest rather than safe. to show him who she really was rather than who she thought he wanted her to be. The next morning, Julian called Mrs. Morrison to his study and asked her to tell him everything she knew about Carmen's situation. The head housekeeper was surprised by his sudden interest in one of the maids, but she was happy to share what she had learned about the Alvarez family's circumstances. She told him about Carmen's dedication to her work, about the long hours she put in without complaint, about the way she had matured beyond her years in order to shoulder responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. "She's a remarkable young woman, Mr. Devereux," Mrs. Morrison said, her Scottish accent lending warmth to her words. "I've worked in wealthy households for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone work as hard as that girl does. She never complains, never asks for special treatment, never makes excuses when things go wrong. She just puts her head down and does whatever needs to be done, and she does it with a smile on her face most of the time." Julian nodded thoughtfully as he listened to Mrs. Morrison's assessment. He had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, but he realized that his wealth and position had created a distance between him and his employees that prevented him from seeing them as individuals rather than merely as functions in his household. Carmen had been working for him for months, but he had never bothered to learn anything about her beyond her ability to perform her assigned tasks. "Tell me about her family," Julian said, settling back in his chair and preparing to listen. "I want to understand what she's dealing with at home, what kind of pressure she's under, what it means to her to have this job. I realize that I may have been too quick to judge her based on one mistake, and I want to make sure I have all the facts before I make any further decisions about her employment." Mrs. Morrison smiled at Julian's request, pleased to see him taking a personal interest in one of his employees for the first time since she had started working for him. She told him about Maria's chronic illness and the medical bills that had drained the family's and Penny savings, about Roberto's struggles to find steady work in an economy that had little use for men his age with limited education, about Diego's intelligence and potential, and Carmen's determination to ensure that he had opportunities for a better life. "The girl is supporting her entire family, Mr. Devereux," Mrs. Morrison explained. "She's 16 years old, and she's carrying the weight of 3 adults on her shoulders. She gives every penny she earns to her parents, keeps nothing for herself except what she needs for transportation and the occasional necessity. She's never missed a day of work, never been late, never failed to complete any task she's been given. If she seems nervous or distracted sometimes, it's because she knows that her family's survival depends on her ability to keep this job." Julian felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he listened to Mrs. Morrison's account. He began to understand that his decision to give Carmen a second chance had been about more than just showing mercy to a clumsy maid. It had been about recognizing the human dignity and worth of someone whose life circumstances were vastly different from his own. He realized that he had the power to change not just Carmen's life, but the lives of her entire family, and that power came with obligations he had never fully considered before. That afternoon, Julian made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him, including himself. He called Carmen to his study and asked her to sit down, then began to speak in a tone that was completely different from the formal, businesslike manner he usually employed with his staff. For the first time since she had started working for him, he spoke to her as if she were a person rather than an employee, and Carmen could sense the change immediately. "Carmen, I want to apologize to you," Julian began, the words feeling strange in his mouth but necessary nonetheless. "I read your letter last night, and I want you to know that it moved me deeply. I also want you to know that my reaction to what happened 3 weeks ago was inappropriate and unfair. You made an honest mistake, and I responded with anger that had more to do with my own stress and pressure than with anything you had done wrong." Carmen looked at Julian with surprise and confusion, unsure how to respond to this unexpected apology. She had never heard a wealthy employer apologize to a servant before, and she wasn't sure what it meant or how she was supposed to react. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue and trying to understand what had prompted this sudden change in his attitude toward her. "I also want you to know that I was deeply moved by your brother's drawing," Julian continued, his voice growing softer as he thought about the simple stick figures that had brought him to tears. "It made me realize that you're not just an employee in my household, you're someone's hero, someone's hope for the future. That's a responsibility I never fully understood before, and it's made me think about my own responsibilities as your employer." Julian paused, gathering his thoughts as he prepared to make an offer that would change everything for Carmen and her family. He had spent hours that morning researching options and making phone calls, using his wealth and connections to create opportunities that hadn't existed before. He wanted to do more than just keep Carmen employed. He wanted to give her and her family a chance at the kind of life they had never dared to dream about. "I've been thinking about your situation," Julian said, "and I realize that having you work as a maid is a waste of your potential and your intelligence. I want to offer you a different position, one that will allow you to use your skills while providing better compensation for your family. I'm creating a new position in my company, a junior administrative assistant role that will give you experience in business operations while allowing you to continue your education." End quote. Carmen stared at Julian in disbelief, unable to process what she was hearing. The idea that he would create a job specifically for her seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. She had expected to be grateful for keeping her current position, but the possibility of advancement and better pay for her family seemed too good to be true. "Mr. Devereux, I don't understand," Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a maid. I don't have any business experience or education beyond high school. Why would you want to give me such an important position? Are you sure you're not making a mistake?" Julian smiled at her response, recognizing the same humility and self-doubt that he had seen in other young people who had been told they weren't worthy of opportunities. He remembered his own early days in business, when mentors had taken chances on him and opened doors that had seemed impossible to open on his own. He realized that he had the power to be that kind of mentor for Carmen, to give her the same opportunities that had been given to him. "Carmen, intelligence and character are more important than experience," Julian explained. "Experience can be taught, but integrity and determination cannot. You've already shown me that you possess both of those qualities in abundance. The fact that you've been, quote, supporting your entire family while maintaining your dignity and your commitment to excellence tells me everything I need to know about your potential." Julian went on to explain that the position would come with a salary that was 3 times what she was currently earning as a maid, enough to cover her family's medical bills and living expenses while still allowing them to build some savings for the future. He also offered to pay for Carmen to attend business classes at the local community college, so that she could develop the skills she would need to advance even further in the company. But Julian's generosity didn't stop there. He had also arranged for Carmen's mother to receive the medical care she needed from the best specialists in the city, with all expenses covered by the company's health insurance plan. He had contacted Roberto and offered him a position in the maintenance department of one of his office buildings, a steady job with good benefits that would restore his dignity and his ability to provide for his family. "And for Diego," Julian said, pulling out a folder from his desk drawer. "I've established an education fund that will cover his tuition and expenses for college when he's ready. I want to make sure that his intelligence and potential aren't wasted because of financial constraints. He deserves the chance to pursue his dreams, whatever they might be." Carmen felt tears streaming down her face as Julian outlined all of the ways he planned to help her family. The magnitude of his generosity was overwhelming, and she struggled to understand why he would do so much for people he barely knew. She thought about Diego's drawing and the simple message of gratitude he had written, and she wondered if that innocent expression of love had somehow touched Julian's heart in a way that her own words never could have. "Why are you doing this?" Carmen asked, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. "I spilled tea on you and embarrassed you in front of important people. I would understand if you had fired me and never wanted to see me again, but instead, you're giving my family more than we ever dreamed of having. I don't understand what I did to deserve such kindness." Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain the transformation that had taken place in his own heart since reading her letter. He thought about the loneliness that had characterized his life for so many years, the way his wealth had isolated him from genuine human connection, the emptiness that had grown inside him despite all of his material success. "Carmen, your letter and your brother's drawing showed me something I had forgotten," Julian said finally. "They showed me what real courage looks like, what real love looks like, what it means to sacrifice for others without expecting anything in return. I've spent so many years focused on profits and productivity that I lost sight of the human element that makes all of that success meaningful." Julian explained that reading about her family's struggles had forced him to confront his own privilege and the responsibilities that came with his wealth. He realized that he had the power to change lives, to create opportunities, to make a real difference in the world beyond just accumulating more money and building bigger companies. "Your brother called you a hero in his drawing," Julian continued. "But the truth is that your family's love and sacrifice have been heroic for me too. You've reminded me that there are things more important than business meetings and profit margins. Things like family and loyalty and the willingness to work hard for the people you love. I want to help your family because helping you helps me remember who I want to be as a person." Carmen listened to Julian's explanation with growing amazement, realizing that their chance encounter had changed both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. She had written the letter hoping to save her job and support her family, but she had never imagined that her words would have such a profound impact on someone who seemed so different from herself. Over the following weeks, Julian kept every promise he had made to Carmen and her family. Carmen began her new position as a junior administrative assistant, working in a bright office in the main headquarters building, where she learned about business operations, customer relations, and Project 18 management. She proved to be a quick learner with a natural aptitude for organization and problem solving, impressing her supervisors with her attention to detail and her willingness to take on new challenges. Carmen's mother, Maria, began receiving treatment from a specialist who was able to manage her condition more effectively than any doctor she had seen before. The improvement in her health was gradual but steady, and for the first time in years she began to have hope that she might be able to return to some kind of normal life. The financial stress that had dominated the family's conversations for so long began to ease as Carmen's new salary and Roberto's steady employment provided them with security they had never known. Roberto thrived in his new position, taking pride in his work and grateful for the opportunity to contribute to his family's well-being once again. He had been devastated by his unemployment and the feeling that he was failing in his role as a provider, but Julian's offer had restored his sense of purpose and dignity. He worked hard to prove himself worthy of the trust that had been placed in him, and his supervisors quickly recognized his reliability and his commitment to excellence. But it was Diego's reaction to the changes in his family's circumstances that moved Julian the most. The 8-year-old boy seemed to understand instinctively that something wonderful had happened, and his natural optimism blossomed into an even brighter confidence about the future. He began to talk about college and career possibilities that had seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier, and his teachers noticed an improvement in his academic performance as the stress and worry disappeared from his teen. Home environment. Julian found himself taking a personal interest in Diego's education and development, occasionally visiting the family's new apartment to check on their progress and to see how the boy was adapting to his changed circumstances. Diego had drawn several more pictures for Julian, each one showing their family in progressively better situations, and Julian kept them all in a special folder in his desk drawer. The relationship between Julian and the Alvarez family continued to evolve as the months passed. What had begun as an employer's obligation to an employee gradually transformed into something deeper and more meaningful. Julian discovered that spending time with Carmen and her family filled a void in his life that he hadn't even realized existed, providing him with a sense of connection and purpose that his business success had never been able to provide. Carmen excelled in her new role, quickly proving that Julian's faith in her abilities had been well-founded. She absorbed new information like a sponge, developed strong relationships with clients and colleagues, and demonstrated the same work ethic and attention to detail that had made her an excellent maid. But more than that, she brought a perspective and a humanity to the workplace that impressed everyone who worked with her. Julian began to rely on Carmen's insights and observations, finding that her unique background and experiences gave her an understanding of people and situations that his more privileged colleagues sometimes lacked. She had a gift for recognizing when someone was struggling or needed help, and she approached every interaction with the same empathy and kindness that had characterized her letter to him. As Carmen's confidence grew, she began to suggest improvements to company policies and procedures that would benefit not just the business, but also the employees who worked there. She advocated for better health insurance coverage, more flexible scheduling for parents, and educational opportunities for workers who wanted to advance their careers. Julian found himself implementing many of her suggestions, realizing that her perspective as someone who had struggled to make ends meet gave her insights that his MBA-educated executives couldn't provide. The transformation in Julian's own life was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The cold, calculating businessman who had erupted in fury over a stained shirt gradually gave way to someone who was more thoughtful, more compassionate, and more aware of his impact on the people around him. He began to take a more personal interest in his employees, learning their names and their stories, understanding the challenges they faced both at work and at home. Julian's business practices began to change as well. He started implementing policies that prioritized employee welfare alongside profit margins, investing in training and development programs that would help his workers advance their careers. He established a foundation that provided scholarships for the children of company employees, and he began looking for ways to use his wealth and influence to address some of the systemic issues that created situations like the one Carmen's family had faced. The other executives in Julian's company were initially puzzled by the changes in his leadership style, but they couldn't argue with the results. Employee satisfaction increased, productivity improved, and the company began to attract top talent who were drawn to Julian's reputation as an employer who genuinely cared about his workers. The business continued to grow and prosper, but now that success was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose rather than fear and intimidation. Carmen's influence on Julian extended beyond the workplace as well. She introduced him to aspects of life that his wealth had shielded him from, showing him the joy that could be found in simple pleasures and genuine relationships. Through her family, he experienced the warmth and love that came from people who truly cared about each other, who were willing to make sacrifices for the common good, who found happiness in each other's success rather than in material possessions. Julian began spending holidays with the Alvarez family, sharing meals around their modest kitchen table and participating in traditions that were new and meaningful to him. He discovered that Diego's drawings had evolved to include him as a stick figure in the family portraits, and he found himself treasuring these simple artistic expressions more than any expensive artwork in his mansion. The relationship between Julian and Carmen also deepened in ways that surprised both of them. What had begun as a professional mentorship gradually developed into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Carmen's intelligence and character continued to impress Julian, while his generosity and growth as a person earned her admiration and gratitude. As Carmen's 18th birthday approached, Julian realized that he wanted to do something special to mark the occasion and to celebrate how far she had come in the 2 years since the tea incident that had brought them together. He had been thinking about ways to recognize her contributions to the company, and to acknowledge the impact she had had on his own life. Julian decided to promote Carmen to a management position, making her the youngest department head in the company's history. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to shape policy and direction for an entire division of the business. But more than that, it represented Julian's complete confidence in her abilities and his recognition of her as a true partner in the company's mission. When Julian announced Carmen's promotion at the company's annual meeting, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Her colleagues had watched her growth and development over the previous 2 years, and they respected her intelligence, her work ethic, and her genuine concern for others. They knew that her success was well-deserved, and that she would use her new position to continue making positive changes throughout the organization. Carmen's family was overjoyed by the news of her promotion, but they were even more grateful for the stability and security that Julian's intervention had brought to their lives. Maria's health had continued to improve, Roberto had been promoted to a supervisory position in his department, and Diego was excelling in a private school that Julian had arranged for him to attend. The 8-year-old boy who had once drawn stick figures to thank his sister for saving the family had grown into a confident and articulate 10-year-old who spoke eloquently about his dreams of becoming a brick, doctor, or an engineer. His teachers consistently praised his intelligence and his character, noting that he possessed the same combination of humility and determination that had made his sister so successful. Julian often reflected on the chain of events that had brought the Alvarez family into his life, marveling at how a moment of clumsiness and anger had ultimately led to such profound changes for everyone involved. He kept Diego's original drawing framed on his desk, a constant reminder of the power of forgiveness, the importance of second chances, and the transformative nature of genuine human connection. The story of Julian Devereux and Carmen Alvarez became something of a legend within the company and the broader business community. People spoke of it as an example of how compassion and understanding could bridge the gap between different worlds, how one person's willingness to look beyond surface mistakes could change multiple lives for the better. Carmen continued to thrive in her management role, becoming known throughout the industry as a rising star who combined business acumen with genuine care for people. She never forgot the lessons she had learned during her family's struggles, and she used her position to advocate for policies and practices that would help other families avoid the desperation she had once known. Julian's transformation from a ruthless businessman to a compassionate leader became a case study in business schools and leadership programs. His story demonstrated that true success came not just from accumulating wealth and power, but from using those resources to make a positive impact on the lives of others. Years later, when Diego graduated as valedictorian of his high school class and earned a full scholarship to study engineering at a prestigious university, Julian was there to celebrate with the family that had become so important to him. As he watched the young man deliver his graduation speech about the importance of perseverance and the power of family support, Julian thought about the crayon drawing that had started it all. The stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun had represented more than just a child's gratitude for his sister's sacrifice. They had symbolized the bonds that connect us all, the potential for understanding and compassion that exists even between people from vastly different backgrounds, and the possibility for transformation that lies within every human heart. Carmen's thank you letter had saved more than just her job that day. It had saved Julian from a life of isolation and meaningless success, shown him the path to genuine fulfillment, and taught him that the greatest achievements come not from what we accumulate for ourselves, but from what we give to others. The little maid who had spilled tea on the Millionaire CEO had indeed changed everything, not through her mistake, but through her courage to be vulnerable, to ask for help, and to show him that behind every employee, every servant, every person he encountered, there was a story worth knowing and a life worth caring about. And in the end, Julian Devereux discovered that the greatest success of his life had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. It had everything to do with a 16-year-old girl who had taught him that true wealth was measured not in dollars and cents, but in the lives you touch, the hope you inspire, and the love you choose to share with the world.